Communicable Disease Control and state epidemiologist. It's my pleasure here to welcome you to this seminar on disease and stigma, which is associated with an exhibit at the Public Health Museum on Hansen's disease that you will have it. Oh, and the phone's working too. That you have the opportunity to see, hopefully over the lunchtime, if it's close by. We're having the seminar here in this building because the last year when we had a seminar in the so-called old chapel, which is right next door to the museum, the ambient temperature was about 40 degrees in the room. And we figured, that was in May, so we figured that we wouldn't chance that in March. But the museum is close by, and we will give you directions on how to get there. It's very easy to find. I just want to do a few housekeeping things. And I lost my paper. Did I see it under your Yep. We're in the main building at Tewksbury Hospital right now, and one of the sacrifices of holding an event like this in a historic building is we're holding it in a historic building. So let me explain the bathrooms to you. They're out the door and to the right. There's a men's room and women's room. After you're through, you obviously close the door when you're in there, but after you're through, for no reason, close the door unless somebody else is going in there. Because once you close the door, you lock it. Now, if it does get locked and you're out there, everybody who works here has a key. So you flag down somebody who works here and they'll open the door for you if we get into trouble. There's another bathroom over here. Lunch will be in this room. It'll be basically a buffet lunch that'll be set up where breakfast is set up. We'll have the coffee will be refreshed, coffee and juice and so forth will be refreshed at 10 a.m. And all of the activity will be in this room except for the option to go over to the museum. The museum will be opened from 10 to 2, and somebody will be there. If somebody wants to go at a different time, that's fine too. But we really scheduled 12 to 1:30 for the museum time. So you can have your lunch, go over there. You can come back and have your lunch after you visit the museum. There's a payphone, a very primitive device. There's a payphone, very hard to find. There's a payphone right outside the door too, because many of you find that you might have trouble with your cell phone, so that might come in handy. Let me just say that it's been wonderful. It's always wonderful to have a meeting here, although we have challenges in terms of phone jacks and bathrooms and so forth. The staff here are really terrific. And I just want to, before the end of the day, because you often leave this to the end, I want to say now how much I appreciate how easy it is to work with the food services here, in particular Pam Andrewitz and Diane Shortliff, Debbie Pucci, and Danielle Shepherdson from the various components of Tewksbury Hospital have been terrific, and especially Patty Jo Hanley, who's spent the last hour trying to figure out how to get the phone connected and seems to have actually done it. One thing, though, that everybody's concerned about is the number of cords on the floor here. So if you happen to be walking around during lunch or during for some reason during the seminar, please be very careful about the cords on the floor. We don't want anybody tripping and getting injured. This seminar is sponsored by the Department of Public Health, in particular the components Tewksbury Hospital and Bureau of Communicable Disease Control, and the Public Health Museum. And I would commend to you the Public Health Museum, which has been on the campus here for 11 years now, as a resource, and you'll find information over in the museum when you go over there. We welcome people to become members of the museum, donors to the museum, and I think you'll find that both the Hansen disease exhibit and the other exhibits in the museum of great interest. It's also an archive for a lot of materials from both the hospital and the Department of Public Health and other health agencies. So if you're involved in research or you're involved in genealogy, for example, it is a resource that people are welcome to use. The phone number is basically the number here at the hospital, and I'm not going to say the extension because I may get it wrong, but it'll be on the materials that you'll receive. Without further ado, let me introduce the moderator for today's seminar. Mange Johansen is the curator of the Hansen's disease exhibit at the museum and has a long history of interest in Hansen's disease, and basically brought that interest to the department, I guess, back in 94, was it? Back in 1994, and did a great service to us in reviewing the materials that we had in our possession from Pennake's Island, the only state sponsor. I don't say this proudly, it's just a matter of fact. It was the only state-sponsored leprosarium in the United States, although there were other facilities that were started by states and localities. Massachusetts had this facility that you're going to hear about later in the day. And we had the records from that, and Paul reviewed those records and assisted us in a joint effort at recognizing Dr. Parker, who was the superintendent there, with a plaque in the State House. Dr. Parker was there from 1907 to 1921, and when he left there, he couldn't get any work. He was a practitioner in Malden, Massachusetts, took the job with the state, and basically because he had taken care of people with Hansen's disease for all of those years, he couldn't get another job when he left, and the state denied him a pension. So, and I have to say this is associated with the Department of Public Health taking over the facility from the Department of Charity, another sort of historical fact I'm not proud of, but is a historical fact. He actually wound up moving to Montana to live with his son, who was a famous rickettsiologist at the Rocky Mountain Laboratory out in Montana, and did a lot of pioneering work, was a student of rickets, I believe, and did a lot of pioneering work in rickettsiology. So let me turn this over to Paul.
We'll find out. Good morning. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. My name is Paul Johansen, Paul Mange Johansen, and I am curating the exhibit over in the main administration building. Today is World Tuberculosis Day. It happened actually by chance that this seminar on disease and stigma is taking place on World Tuberculosis Day. We'll hear a little bit later this afternoon about some tie-ins between Hansen's disease and tuberculosis, as well as some tie-ins between Hansen's disease and HIV/AIDS. I also want to thank Dr. DiMaria for inviting me to assemble the exhibit. It's been a pleasure for me. This is, as he mentioned, been a long-standing interest in mine since I was in college. It stemmed originally from a bit of Norwegian pride. Dr. Hansen, who I'll say a few words about and show you a few slides about, was a Norwegian physician who discovered the bacterium that causes this disease. He discovered that back in 1873. It was, I believe, the first chronic disease of humans to be attributed to a bacterium. So he was very forward-thinking in his scientific outlook on this disease. One thing that I hope you come away with today is a sense that this disease, while it has important medical components, has a very strong social component. I was speaking earlier with Jose Ramirez, one of the other speakers today, to see if he could think of a disease that had so much emotional baggage, if you will, attached to it. And he couldn't come up with one. He had mentioned, and I'm sure he'll talk about this later, people with this disease traditionally have been thought of as essentially never recovering. Once you have this disease, you are always associated as a person who has this disease. And it's, to say the least, unfortunate, and from a scientific point of view, quite inappropriate. So I hope that today you come away with a sense of perhaps why it is that people react so strongly against this disease. I think it's also important that we recognize that although this disease is now under control and has been since the 1940s when the first antibiotics were introduced to treat this disease, that we're also in a phase of emerging infectious diseases. HIV/AIDS didn't exist 30 years ago, and now obviously it's a major worldwide public health problem. SARS was probably the first disease to emerge where almost instantaneously you had worldwide attention focused on a new disease. West Nile virus is another example, and obviously avian flu. So I think it's important that we spend a bit of time looking at how we as a society, how we as a people, different cultures, respond to disease, because these are issues that we're going to continue to face. The Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta is in the process of revising their quarantine laws for the first time in 25 years. There's a natural tension between protecting the public health from obvious disease threats, and it is clearly the job of the government to protect the public from diseases. On the other hand, we live in a free society, and one has to be very careful about treading on the civil liberties of people who have the disease. So over the course of the day, I think we'll learn a little bit more about how those tensions have played themselves out with regard to Hansen's disease. And hopefully we can learn some lessons from that and apply them to new emerging diseases. A bit about today's schedule. I'm very happy to report we have a number of excellent speakers. This is essentially my personal dream team of speakers on Hansen's disease. I will be introducing each speaker briefly as they come up. Before I do that, I want to show a few slides talking about Hansen. This is really the only opportunity early in the day to talk about Hansen himself and a little bit of background on some of the biology of the disease. It's really just a brief overview, and you'll be learning more throughout the course of the day, particularly in the second lecture. One adjustment to the schedule is that the second speaker from Merck and Company in Pennsylvania is unable to make it in person because he has an important meeting with federal regulators, but he will be phoning in. So the reason that the phone lines are here, hoping that we can connect him to a phone, and you'll hear his voice over the microphone, and I will be switching slides for him, and also you have his presentation in your handout. So hopefully that will go smoothly. Appreciate your patience with that. All right, hopefully you can see in the back, the first slide says there will be no control of leprosy if the stigma of the disease is not first eradicated. One problem, obviously, is coming up with therapies for the disease, but that's really only the first step in treating the disease. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the basic science and the biology, while critical to understand, is not the only way that you eradicate disease. And what you really need is public support to eradicate a disease, and stigma interferes with that process in important ways that we will learn about a little bit later. Here's a slide that shows the worldwide prevalence of Hansen's disease throughout the world. What you see is that it is primarily a tropical disease. India and Brazil are probably the two countries with the most prevalence. This happens to be a slide from 1994. There are pockets in Africa as well where there's disease. It is, as we learned recently from Pope Benedict, primarily a disease of poverty, where people are living in very close quarters. It is probably the least contagious of all the infectious diseases. 95% of people are naturally immune and could never get the disease. One reason, originally it was thought to be a hereditary disease because some of the early scientists, including Dr. Danielson, who was Hansen's boss in Bergen, Norway, believed that it was hereditary because he actually injected himself with material from patients in a scientific attempt to see if it was communicable. Not just himself, but as science was done 100 years ago, everybody in the lab was injected with material, and nobody got it. So he concluded, and not irrationally, that it was not a contagious disease. The reason for that is it's a very minimally contagious disease. In addition to a susceptibility, you need prolonged exposure, which also tends to run in families and created a picture of a hereditary disease. It's very difficult to grow this bacterium in the laboratory, so it's been progress medically has been very slow, but it has been made. So, in terms of the numbers of people worldwide with the disease, if we talked about this 10 years ago, we would be talking on the order of maybe 10 million people. These are people who have been infected at one point or another. That number has been revised down quite substantially, essentially because they've changed the definition of who has this disease. If somebody's been treated with the disease and is no longer infectious, and essentially the disease has been removed as a problem, they're no longer counted as a case, and that makes a lot of sense. So worldwide, we're now talking about hundreds of thousands of people rather than millions of people. This is a bacterium that invades nerves primarily, and the most common, although the bacterium itself tends to occur in tropical zones of the world, it has occurred in most countries throughout history, not in Norway, which is where it was prevalent when Hansen did his work. Obviously, it occurs in Northern Europe. It's been eradicated as a problem in many first world countries. However, the bacterium itself, once it gets in the system, prefers cooler parts of the body. So it tends to invade the nerves of the hands and feet. It tends to invade the nerves of the face, the nose, ears. This is sort of a schematic of where the bacterium, where in the body the bacterium prefers to exist. Some of the myths that I'm hoping will be dispelled today, I'm going to start with right now. Because the bacterium invades the nerves, what it does is create insensitive hands and feet, essentially. People who have this disease can no longer feel their hands and feet, so what they do is they get repeated cuts and injury. What we think of typically as a person with Hansen's disease is sort of a secondary effect of the disease. What happens when your hands and feet are insensitive is that you get direct injury. You also have bloodlessness, inflammation, and infection, and those tend to shrink the bones of the hands and the feet, which is why over years and years with the disease, people tend to have these sorts of disfigurements. Here are some of the treatments. These are the chemical diagrams of the antibiotics that are used to treat Hansen's disease. There are three primary ones that are used now: dapsone, clofazimine, and rifampin. There are a few others in addition, including thalidomide, which is fairly interesting, and Jose may talk about therapies a little bit later in some more detail. Let me say a few words about Hansen, and then I will pass the program on. This is a map of Norway. Bergen, Norway is sort of on the lower left. That is where Hansen did his work with leprosy back in the late 1800s. Here's a photograph of Hansen from about 1873, which is when he discovered the bacterium. Here's a later picture of him closer to 1910. This is the paper from 1874 where he pronounced his discovery of the bacterium. He was very thorough and methodical in looking at microscopic samples. He worked in an age where staining techniques were essentially non-existent. So he faced a number of challenges and was just, for reasons that honestly I still am not quite sure of, he was convinced this was a bacterial disease. And eventually published his findings in the Norwegian Medical Journal in 1874. There was an issue about whether he was the rightful discoverer or not, because nobody read Norwegian journals outside of Norway. And a young German physician who had visited Hansen and gotten samples from Hansen went back to Germany and stained the bacterium and published a paper saying, "Eureka, I've discovered the cause of leprosy." But he is the rightful discoverer, and Hansen's disease is named after him in his honor. He wrote later in life a very interesting memoir. I have a few interesting quotes from that, one of which I'll share in a few minutes, and some a little bit later. He's been honored in stamps and coins and other memorabilia. Since it is World Tuberculosis Day, I think I will mention how tuberculosis had influenced Hansen. Hansen worked with a physician named Daniel Cornelius Danielson, and the same year, in fact, the month before he really made his discovery, he married Danielson's daughter, Stephanie Marie. It was 1873 was both a good and a bad year for Hansen. 9 months after they were married, his wife died of tuberculosis. It's something that he doesn't mention at all in the memoirs, which is interesting. But I think it's important to keep in mind that disease affects everybody, and that these are important lessons that we still need to work on. So let me conclude my remarks with that and introduce the first speaker, John Harley Warner.